Welcome to our second video on negative behaviors in children. And this time, instead of the first one where we were understanding negative behaviors, this time we're going to be talking about redirecting negative behaviors, which is what our natural next step should be. Once we understand it, how do we redirect the negative behavior, or maybe even avoid the negative behavior from beginning in the first place? So there's a couple psychologists, theorists that we want to look at. Haim Ginott, I believe is how to say it. This guy is a famous psychologist who was also a classroom teacher, and his theories are really helpful in building relationships with students by setting the right boundaries and paying attention to emotions. So first off, he argues you do need to set limits for children, but you do that by using compassion, not necessarily authoritarian approach. We also really want to pay attention to his theory of congruent communication. It's very effective, and that involves these kinds of behaviors. So when an adult is talking to a child about a problem, we talk in the present tense, not focusing on past of what they've been doing, not assuming that they're going to make the mistake again in the future. We want to assume the best. So we're just going to focus on right now. We want to act as a role model. So we're going to model the right behavior and how to communicate and how to behave. We also want to always treat the child as an equal. That means no belittling. He gives a wonderful set of examples, and there's a nice YouTube video you can look up of him actually doing an interview where he talks about this. And he says that we should talk to children the way we would talk to guests, other adults who came to our home as a guest. And so he gives a nice example of if your friend came over for dinner and spilled a glass of wine, how would you behave? Would you belittle them? Would you talk about how irresponsible they are and how they've done this a bunch of times before? Or would you just say, oh no, the wine spilled, here's something to clean it up? And so that's what he argues for, that we should treat children as we would treat an adult, because that shows the respect that they require. And we don't want to go overboard on correcting problems that even adults have, right? That's the whole treating them as equals aspect of this approach, right? And finally, he talks about the solutions, not the problems, and not blaming, right? He gives another example of if your friend came over and forgot an umbrella and it started to rain, how would you talk to them about it? Would you say, every time you leave the house, you forget something like this and you're irresponsible? Would you compare them to their younger sister? Why can't you be like your sister who never forgets these things? You would never talk to another adult that way, not very likely anyway. And so we shouldn't do that to children either. We should show them the exact same respect we show an adult. And that actually encourages them to be more mature, right? Because they're now put in a position of equality. He was a classroom teacher, so he talks a lot about ways to enact these things that are helpful in keeping a positive environment. And so one of those is modeling communication that's congruent, like we just talked about, paying attention to their emotions and the surroundings, always using cooperative learning, which means everybody should have a part in what's going on. Everybody can contribute in some way, shape, or form, regardless of the level they're at or the age they're at. They should all be involved. And then using discipline in place of punishment. And this is a really important concept, because if we took that word discipline and we took it out of an education setting and we put it somewhere else, let's say we go to a basketball game and I notice this player is doing really well and I say, he's very disciplined. He must be very disciplined. Well, that has a whole different meaning, doesn't it? Than if we were saying that we're going to discipline a child in school. The same would go if I were talking to someone in academia and ask them what they study. I might say, what is your discipline? Oh, that's wonderful. You've studied this so much. And now I'm talking about someone who has spent time practicing and perfecting something in both of those instances, as opposed to in a school setting, we use the word discipline to mean punishment, right? We're kind of using it in the wrong way. We're talking about consequences or correcting wrongs, but that's not really the way the word should be used. And so if we think of discipline in school as practicing the right way, as opposed to correcting the wrong way, it has a whole new meaning. And that is what this theorist would advocate for. The other one that we are going to talk about is Thomas Gordon. And he advocates for building meaningful relationships with children. So they both have very similar approaches. This one talks a lot about how conflicts can be resolved with relationships. And we want that conflict to be resolved in a way that benefits everyone involved in the situation, right? So if you have children and there's a conflict, you would talk with them in a way that can resolve it for everyone so that everybody walks away feeling like it's resolved and they feel okay about it. We want to all agree that the resolution makes sense. That also means that if there's a problem, the solution to it should match the problem, right? For example, sitting in detention doesn't actually match any conflict or problem that takes place. Making a mess, let's clean it up, right? Not completing your work, oh, let's take some more time and complete it. Let me help you, right? Those are just natural solutions to problems for everybody, as opposed to focusing on more consequence style kind of situations. There's also an important concept here called active listening, which means that we would be utilizing the I message. So that means we replace you statements with I statements. So instead of saying things like, you did this wrong, I need you to do that, you're always doing that, you have this problem, don't do that, those command kind of statements or you statements, we switch it with I and actually talk about how I feel. So here's some practical advice then. So what do I do with this information? Here's what it looks like. First off, set some boundaries. And I'm not going to read all these things to you, but you can pause the screen and take a look at the examples. So set some boundaries and model what the right way to do it is. That's the respectful way to show children, as opposed to scolding them. We want to prepare them with time limits so that they know what to expect, right? It's not fair to catch them off guard. And a lot of times problems and conflicts arise when children have not enough time or too much time. And so we want to think about timing, set those limits, and let them know when something is going to begin, when something is going to end. And I also suggest having alternatives available just in case things don't work out the way you expect, because sometimes that transition time is where it results in problems, because some children don't know what to do with that extra time. And so when they start to fill it with other things, we create problems, right? We want to also remember, as discussed, to be compassionate. We want to assume the best, as opposed to blaming or talking negative to them or talking down to them. We want to assume that that is not what they intended, right? So I'll give an example. I recently spoke with a child who was having a problem making a negative comment to another kid in the room. And I pulled him aside and spoke to him one-on-one. And I said, I think you're typically a very nice person. It doesn't seem like you to say something like that. So is that what you intended with that statement? And he says, no, that's not what I meant. I was just trying to be funny, right? Okay, so now that we understand that, probably some people don't think that's funny. Here's why. We can have a better conversation as equals, person to person, as opposed to, an authoritative kind of downward conversation where it's a one way and I'm telling them don't do that. Instead, we want to have a conversation where we're on equal playing ground. I'm still facilitating it and mentoring the child, but I'm not going to speak down to them and assume wrongdoing. Lastly, like I mentioned, I statements. So here's some examples. It's okay to be vulnerable with a child and tell them how you feel about something. It can feel awkward at first, and sometimes kids are not ready for it and they're surprised by it when you do. But I think it's worthwhile, and you'll see that often when you are willing to do that, kids will respond very well and now actually see you as a whole person because they recognize you're acknowledging them as a whole person. I hope that those are helpful tips for you, and please reach out if you need any further assistance with these topics.